Man, we got a lot to unpack in this episode 8 of HBO's Lovecraft Country. I'm still kind of confused on some things. I mean, this episode gave me shades of episode 1, episode 2, episode 5. I love this episode. There were some things I didn't like about this episode. We got the Emmett Till stuff. We got the Montrose stuff. We got the Leti having a baby stuff. So we're going to discuss that and much more. Episode 8 of Lovecraft Country was titled Jig-a-Bobo. A distraught Diana finds herself in Captain Lancaster's crosshairs. When a visitor from his past arrives at the boarding house, Atticus and Leti each take steps to protect their future. Hey, what's going on, everybody, and welcome back to my channel, Movie Files. Elliot back again with my weekly review, breakdown, and recap of the latest episode of HBO's Lovecraft Country. Man, this episode has so many things going on, so many different reveals, moments I loved, moments I didn't love, and we're going to break it all down in this spoiler discussion, ladies and gentlemen. But before we dive into it, as you all can see on the screen now, make sure you're following me on all my other social media accounts. That way you all can stay up to date with what's going on over here at Movie Files. If you're new to this channel, welcome. Definitely subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of my other Lovecraft Country reviews, other TV reviews, movie reviews, live streams, and all the fun things we do on this very channel. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up. Helps out the channel, but I also really appreciate it. And in the comments, ladies and gentlemen, let's have a full discussion about the things you enjoyed, the underlying tones and themes that I might have missed in this review I'm going to go over. Let me know your predictions, your theories, and let's just have an open discussion about this episode. So first and foremost, the title is a racial slur, no less, referring to black people, more or less the stereotypical African-American physical features. So with that title alone, we've all been speculating. Number one, Bobo is a nickname of Emmett Till, and we know that he's been in a couple episodes, and we kind of speculated that is this show going to tackle what happened? Is it going to show what happened? And we obviously will talk about it in this review here, but man, just knowing that title, I knew that we were going to get into some racially kind of storyline with Emmett Till, but also stuff with some other things going on in the 1950s. So, man, this episode had, like I had mentioned up top, before I even get into my review, like I do every week, just overall thoughts. Borderline think this may be my favorite episode, but at the same time, there were particular storylines like Dee's storyline, which I love stuff that she did in this episode, but the other stuff didn't really work for me. We'll get into it once we get there, but this was a very fascinating episode because to me, again, it had the racial undertone of what we got from episode 1, as well as that stuff that happened at the end of this episode that was very similar to episode 1. We get a lot of magic, just like we got in episode 2. We get one of the most incredible visual scenes I've seen this year with Ruby transforming from Dale and going back to herself with that sex scene with William. And then there's things that just, it was a lot that went down in this episode, guys. So we're going to get into this recap. Let's just break it off, starting off with the beginning of this episode. So as I kind of address, we've been speculating for weeks, what are they going to do with this Emmett Till storyline? And they give us the funeral, guys. They show us the aftermath of the most tragic thing that really sparked the civil rights movement in the 1950s. With the funeral, we see, obviously, Dee. We know that was a close friend of hers. We see that she's emotional and upset what's going on. And then within this scene, we see that Tick's there at the funeral. Ruby's there. Leti's there. Montrose is there. And also, too, there was something that I noticed that Tick was saying to Letitia, which was, hey, are you okay? You've been on your feet too long. Do you need some water? You need to sit down. I'm thinking to myself, have they had the conversation about this baby that's on its way, which we'll obviously talk about in this episode. But I was just like, Tick, they've had a conversation, but we find out how Tick ended up finding out about this baby. But as we kind of move forward, we see Letitia, she brings up that Dee has suffered a lot. And we've seen that in this season, right? From the loss of her father to, which, by the way, a lot of you all had talked about it in the comments last week. I don't know if you guys watch the podcast they do every week for the HBO Lovecraft Country recaps with, I believe her name is Sharon Houston, who's the writer of the show, and there's another lady, and they have some really great conversations. I haven't watched all the episodes, or I should say listened to all the episodes, but I listened to episode 7's recap, and something that they confirmed, and I think confirms it in this episode, Hippolyta ain't coming back anytime soon, so I don't know if this is a thing that we might see her at the finale, or she's off traveling the galaxy, the multiverse, and liberating herself finding out more about herself, or she is gathering enough information to help her family. So it's interesting to say, because like I said, in that podcast, they confirmed that she's not coming back at least anytime soon. They didn't say that she was gone forever, but she's not there for her daughter. And they revealed in this episode that it's been a week since we've last seen our cast and crew. So it's been a week time that Hippolyta has been missing. And Dee is obviously, like I said, not only has she lost her father, now she thinks she's lost her mom, and then she's lost her best friend. So man, that young girl is going through it, guys. So we see that she kind of gets lost within the crowd. And I'm just like, Tick, Leti, Montrose, Ruby, y'all can't keep an eye on the little girl. Y'all can't see where she's going. But either way, and we'll talk about kind of the selfish nature of all of our characters, the good and the bad, and all the people in between. So we'll get into that. So we see as the episode kind of gets started, we see Dee is just kind of, again, she's just out of body right now, right? Again, so much loss has taken place with this young girl in this season. So we see she's wandering the streets of Chicago. She comes across these two little black girls that are eating ice cream, that are kind of laughing. And Dee's upset. She just lost her best friend. She grabs some rocks, throws it at the little girls. And this is something I want to talk about, especially a little bit later in the episode when we have Ruby talking to Christina. It's about grieving, how people handle grieving, right? Obviously during this time, all the shops and all the stuff are closed down because of the death of Emmett Till, and it's just such a huge moment in American history. So it's just like for Dee, she's just like, why are you laughing? Why are you out and about eating ice cream? This isn't a time to be laughing and a time to have fun. This is a time to mourn. This is a time to be upset, as we'll talk about with Ruby. So very interesting moment there. So as we kind of move forward, we see that Captain Lancaster, who we haven't seen in quite a few weeks, he finds Dee. I don't know. I assume he was able to find her because he has magic, this, that, and the other, whatever. We'll let that kind of, I don't want to say a plot hole, but the convenience of him finding her so easily after we knew last week that she left, or I should say her mother left that comic book, and, putting two to two together, they put the names together. I don't know if it was an address on there, but nevertheless, he finds her. He asks her about her mother. We see one of the cops that's with him is marking the ground, setting up this spell that we kind of see, and he asks her, do you know about magic? Which she simply replies, from the fantasy books, and he kind of laughs at her. She tries to get away. The cop stops her, and that's where we see Lancaster casting a spell on her, where we see these bugs and flies starting to appear, and one of the most grossest things, I'd hate when people spit in movies and shows. It's just so disgusting. So even though I know that wasn't real spit, it was just the idea of him spitting on her, and the way that the spit was on her face was just really grossing me out, to say the least. But we see the poster, the eyes are starting to follow her as she walks away. So this spell, which we'll talk a little bit about later in regards to what the meaning of that spell may be, but very interesting to say the least. And oh man, we'll talk about the Dee moment where she gets kind of her moment to talk to Lancaster, which was one of my favorite moments of the episode. But as we kind of transition from Dee, we go to Letitia and Gia, ladies and gentlemen. I mentioned it in episode 6. I think that we're going to get a love triangle storyline going on. And man, this was the beginnings of it. We see Gia is at the house, and we'll get to that scene here in a bit. But before we get into it, we wrap into Tick setting up this secret meeting with Christina, who, by the way, man, Christina, she's been lurking in the background throughout these episodes, but she has some really great lines, some great moments. You love the hater. We don't really know her full motive. She wants immortality, as she mentioned in this episode a lot, but I thought that this was probably my favorite Christina episode, even though it was really Dee. Every episode is kind of focused on one character, and this episode was definitely Dee, Diana's, but Christina did her thing in this episode, I will say. So we see this secret meeting of one of many meetings that Christina has with a lot of our characters this episode. But we see, she meets Tick at a graveyard. They're talking about, Christina just being all evil and conniving, talking about she's, you took forever. I'm here with my ancestors. Calls Tick her cousin. She's just being, I really enjoy Christina. I'm not going to lie. I really enjoy her in this episode. But we haven't seen them share a scene together since episode 3, and at the very end when he held a gun at her. So it was the first time they've been speaking since 5 episodes ago. So Christina tells Tick that, she can tell he's desperate. Like, why haven't you called me now? But I can tell you need me now because there's something you need from me, which he kind of reveals to her. And, he gives her the key for the Ori, which she's been looking for this whole time. Tick asks her to cast a spell. To help him cast a spell, and and she tells him about like how the spells can be conjured, right? That it has to be words. It's more than words, but it's energy, it's intention, and when you have those things, you don't want to upset the nature and you don't want any disaster in doing so. So she's giving him little lessons as she's been giving lessons to Ruby, who we'll talk a little bit about later. So again, Christina's, man, she's just very manipulative. She's very conniving. She's setting her pieces to the puzzle together. Again, Christina's episode was just really, really well done to me personally as far as the performance goes. So within this conversation, we see that Christina gives him instructions for this protective spell, I should say, in exchange for the key, which he gives her and tells him, good luck, cousin. Again, she was working all angles in this episode, ladies and gentlemen. So we see she gives him the key, and she tells him that she's he asks, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to rule the world? And she just says, no, I'm just trying to achieve something that no one in the order has done, not even Titus: immortality. So Christina wants to live forever, ladies and gentlemen, to change the test of times, to maybe change the way women are perceived in this world, maybe changing the idea of how Adam and Eve played out and going back in time maybe to change those events. Christina, man, that's the I would say Captain Lancaster is definitely the overarching obvious villain protagonist, or I should say antagonist of the show. But Christina, she's in both lanes for me, guys. But immortality is her goal. So we transition from that. We go to Dee to Montrose, which we haven't really seen them share a scene in quite a while. We see that Dee is at home. She's questioning Montrose about what happened to her mother. He tells her, she's on a trip guide, and we all know Montrose is willing to kill, and hell, he can lie his ass off when it comes to protecting the people that he loves, and has a lot of truths that are hidden, right? So we see Dee, she slams the door, pretends to leave the house, and all getting prepared to leave the house, and Montrose is trying to talk her off the ledge per se, and try to get her to lower her attitude and her temper and her being upset about, number one, her dad, her mom, and now her best friend. And he's telling her about, his best friend that he lost in I assume the Tulsa riots. But we see this book on the shelf, the Uncle Tom's Cabin book, which I wasn't too familiar with. It's an anti-slavery novel that was written back in 1852, and it's a very profound book about African Americans and slavery in the U.S., and definitely something I'm going to look more into, but it definitely was something that helped lay the groundwork for the Civil War. So a very important book, and we know that Lovecraft Country doesn't just throw in these historical figures and historical books and quotes and all that different stuff just for the heck of it. So that book was very influential to the creatures or the girls that were following Dee throughout this episode. So we transition from that whole setup, seeing Dee is just on a mission of seek answers, to just kind of like her mother, explore and look for answers, and kind of find herself within this episode, right? Very similar to what her mom did last week. So as we go from Montrose to Dee, we transition from Ruby, Christina, William, guys. So this scene here, let's break it down. So we get the return of William. Ruby's at the house. This white guy's like, what are you doing here? When questioning her or whatnot. And William kind of gets him off out of the house. And he asks if she was a maid, all this, that, and the other. But the meat of this scene here takes place. We see Ruby describes to William what Emmett Till looked like and how it affected her, right? And I mean, again, if you guys are very familiar with the Emmett Till situation, that is just one of the most despicable things of humanity, and just what came of that. And then 80 years later, the woman confesses that the stuff that she made about Emmett Till, about offending her, was all a lie. I mean, just thinking about it and when watching this episode, this is a very, very emotional and telling episode, to say the least, about, because one of the things I was really concerned about, as I kind of digress here a bit, they've done a good job of portraying historical Black people in America's history, whether it be from novels, books, poems. I was really kind of nervous about this episode, if I'm being honest, because this is a pivotal point of humanity, but also the spark of the civil rights movement. So I like how in this episode they didn't just use that as like a how do I put this, a plot device, right? They use it throughout the episode, showing the characters how they're grieving, how they're dealing with this, very reminiscent of what we're going through in society today, right? I remember very vividly when everything went down with all the injustices that's been going down for the longest time, but then particularly in the last couple of years, and then particularly this year along with, George Floyd and everything. It's just like how people handle grieving, how people are so angry, and how we see how people react to those news, right? Whether it be looting, whether it be rioting, whether it be protesting, whether it be violence. I mean, there's so many range of emotions when you have stuff like this. So I really liked how the show didn't just use Emmett Till as just like a selling point or a plot device. It was integral within the story to see how our characters took the news and how they're enduring the news, right? So as I kind of sidetrack, I appreciated how they didn't just use Emmett Till just as a selling point. So as I kind of go back to this scene here, we see Ruby talking about what's going on in this scene when she is approached by William, and she's upset. So we see some stuff go down. So we see, as Ruby describes what she saw, and we see this transition of her taking a bath and William just, caring for her and washing her back, and it kind of transitions to more than that. It gets a little bit more sexual, and we see, William kisses her, Christina William kisses her, Ruby, and she kind of pauses and realizes that you're Christina. But as they transition to the bedroom, she drinks the potion. She turns back to Dale, and they proceed to have sex, as we see in this scene. And I'm going to say here, so the transition, number one, when she's the metamorphosis, when she changes to Dale, this is the most smoothest we've seen her do so, which kind of might explain going back to when we talked about episode 4, when we saw Christina turn into William so quickly. Well, obviously, the more you do it, the better you get at it. So it still doesn't explain like the clothes coming on him, but as I digress, we see this transition is the smoothest that we've ever seen. And man, that scene, I'm not gonna lie, I watch a lot of movies that have a lot of visual effects, whether it be action movies, horror movies, sci-fi movies. That visual effect of that sex scene when her skin is peeling off as she's, climaxing with William in this scene, that was one of the most impressive things I've seen so far this year. Like, and that even goes to episode 5 that we saw the actual transition, the metamorphosis of that particular episode. That scene, man, that's why I say at the beginning of this episode, I'm sorry if I'm all over the place. This is just such an interesting episode nonetheless, but there was stuff in this episode that was just so strong, visually speaking. The visuals were striking. The dialogue, the acting was incredible. And I'll get to my criticism a little bit later. But stuff like this, that scene that I'm referring to now, was like incredible. As the skin's peeling off while they're having sex, while she's climaxing, it's amazing. So I guess it's assumed to say that the alliance between Ruby, Christina, and William is very strong. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Is it a matter of William, Christina manipulating her and just taking advantage of her, or is it the reverse? Is Ruby using her to get, as we'll talk about later, magic and get some of her powers to kind of disrupt some things? And we'll talk about that, but nonetheless, an incredible scene. So going back to Leti and Tick and Gia, guys. So Tick arrives. He sees the shoes outside the door. He already knows whose shoes those are. We see at the table, we see Leti, we see Gia looking at Tick, and Tick looking at Gia, and then looking at Leti, and Letty's just like, you mother, like the scene speaks for itself, and they didn't even have to say a word. I just love that scene, and we'll get back to it. But let's go back to Dee. We see that she's getting ready to go on a train, where we see she starts to notice someone's following her. So we see as she's getting on a train, there's these two little girls that are looking very kind of Jordan Peele Us type of design. But this character, if I'm not mistaken, again, that comes from the book that we saw in her room, Uncle Tom's Cabin. I think this is the character Topsy, who, from what I gathered, is a character in the book who was a slave, a young girl that was a slave, and she was referred to in the book as the child they called the child a thing. So she was just a slave. She was not a human being to them. She was just a thing, which I think is maybe an undertone of how Captain Lancaster casted the spell, how she saw that book, and how they look at her as a thing. They don't see Dee as a young black girl. They see her as just a creature, and they're just using, they need her to get what they need. So again, let me know if I'm off on that. This Topsy character that we saw throughout this episode, if it's someone else from the book, if it's something else entirely, let me know. Correct me in the comments. I always love reading your comments. So I believe that character that we saw was Topsy from the Uncle Tom Cabin book. So we see that she's obviously scared. She's running away from him. They're trying to get close to her, trying to touch her, trying to kill her, essentially, as we find out later in the episode. But as we go from there, we go back to that love triangle, guys, where we see Gia just really explaining and confirming everything that we kind of speculated in episode 6, that when she was having sex with those 99 souls, she didn't see the future at all. She only saw the beginning of their lives to up into that death. But when she was with Tick, we all know it was completely different. she not only saw the beginning of his life, but she saw the future, which we really haven't gotten confirmation of how she was able to do that. A lot of you all are speculating that it's because he has magic, it's because of his bloodline, it's because of all the stuff that we know what goes on with his family, but we really haven't got that confirmation of why she was able to see into his future. So clearly at this point, Tick is pissed because right now his old girl is around his new girl, so very interesting moment there, but he's seeking answers. Why do I die? When do I die? And Gia doesn't know. She's there to warn you, bro. She don't know all this stuff. This is the first time for her, but obviously at this point, Letitia is obviously upset, and she points out the reason he asks her, Gia, why the hell are you here if you can't give me answers? And then Letitia's like, well, because she loved you, used to love you. I think she still loves you, Tick. But either way, we see Letitia leaves the room. In this love meeting a Tick, he tells Gia, and I felt so bad for Gia, guys. I hope we get more of Gia, and I was hoping that the scene at the end of this episode was going to be Gia maybe attacking the police officer. We'll get to that scene a little bit later, but man, I feel so bad for Gia because he tells her what we had was nothing. Get the hell out of here. I mean, I feel so bad for her. I hope we get more of Gia, hopefully next episode or the finale, because I love that character, and Jamie Chung is great in that role, but I felt so bad for her. But as we kind of move forward, he runs after Leti, and they have a conversation. This is just great acting. This reminded me of Marriage Story, seeing two couples who clearly love each other, but there's so many things that they haven't been telling each other, so many things they've been dealing with. But as we see in this scene, Tick tells her, she's like, you're not telling me the truth. You never told me the full truth. Why didn't you tell me about Gia? And he's like, I didn't know, but I did kind of know. And as my father done, and as everyone does in this show, we feel like keeping the truth is protecting you. So that is a very common theme in the Freeman family, right? Whether it be George, whether it be Hippolyta, whether it be Montrose, and now Tick. It seems like they think lying is the best remedy, but it isn't, as we can clearly see. But, they have their back and forth, and she tells him, that ever since you came back, people have been dying, minus you. And then he walks out of the room. So again, they're just going back and forth. So Letitia follows him upstairs as he drops the bombs on her about meeting with Christina, about giving her the key, about learning about the spell. And she's just like, dude, why can't you just tell me the goddamn truth about what's going on? So, and he doesn't need to be making these decisions alone. So, long story short, he ends up leaving, and Letitia is obviously just upset by this. So it's just a really great scene. But again, she has a great point, guys. It's like, at this point in time, y'all have been fighting monsters, magic, ghosts. I mean, you go on this Indiana Jones trip. You got these metamorphoses. I mean, you need to be telling the truth, guys. You need to be on the same page. But as we kind of move forward, we go back to Christina and Ruby. Ruby approaches her about, again, what happened to Emmett Till. And this is where, like I said, in this episode, it's such an interesting conversation about how we grieve, and especially, again, with the injustices that go on in America with, unarmed black men, unarmed black women being killed by police for no apparent reason other than fear. And this was interesting, man, because this is such a conversation I have a lot with a lot of people. It's just like how people grieve in these moments, especially during the George Floyd situation and the looting and the rioting and the protesting and the peaceful protesting. It's just like how people handle that is so different, right? We see how some people took that anger and used it in the wrong way. We saw how some people took that anger and did something positively and are making changes, and how some people didn't react, and how some people's lack of reaction upset people. And it's just like within that scene, you have all those fascinating conversations, how people handle death. And I love how in this scene, again, Christina was just dropping some truth bombs on Ruby, where she says, when Ruby asks her, do you even care about what just happened? She says, no, I don't care about what happened to Emmett Till. I don't care what happened to a lot of the other black people that died during that time. And honestly, I don't think you care, which she kind of alludes to, you decided to come home, have sex with me. And Ruby even tells her, let me backtrack a little bit, but she decided to have sex with her, with that skin, because she didn't want to be a black woman having sex with a white man during this time. So again, the dialogue in this scene was just so fascinating to me, guys. So this is just such a great conversation. Let me know what you all thought about this scene. Let me know how you feel about this scene. Let me know the truth that you felt within this moment, within these two characters. Let's just have some great dialogues about this in the comments below. So again, like I said, Christina tells her she doesn't care. Super cold-hearted moment here. And again, Christina was just absolutely heartless in this episode, and I love the performance. This is the first time we really get the most from that character. But as they kind of talk about the scene, again, so much to unpack. Ruby's position, was Christina right about what she said about Ruby? Was Ruby right about what she said? And again, this the range of emotions that we go through as people when we see these tragic deaths happen to black people, happen to minorities, unarmed minorities, and it's just a conversation I want to have with you all in the comments. Let's keep it civil. Let's keep it, a good conversation. But let's talk about it in the comments, guys. So as we kind of move forward, we go back to Dee going to Leti. She's running to the boarding house. We see that Dee is going to Letitia's house, and she's obviously upset about what happened to Tick. But it kind of got me upset in this moment because, first off, Letitia, you were looking for Dee. We got to remember at the beginning of this episode when they lost Dee, Diana, they were looking for her, but now you see her and you can care less. And it was just like, it really kind of highlighted that all of our characters, this goes for Atticus, this goes for Montrose, this goes for Uncle George, this goes for Hippolyta. These characters, Ruby, Christina, William, these characters are very selfish. And that's why I actually love these characters and I love this show, because it just shows you that everyone has their flaws. Everyone has their positive things, their negative things. So I love when characters are so well-rounded and so shaped that it shows you just the raw, true human emotions that we do put ourselves before others at times. And Letitia did that in this scene where she's clearly, Dee is bothered. She is being chased by something. And it's like, Letitia, you got to believe her because you've seen some things of yourself. You've come back from life or from death. But, we see Letitia, her mind is just obviously on that conversation she just had with her boyfriend. And, Dee still sees these Topsy-like characters following her, and she sees the car. And, first off, Letitia's like, oh, just get some water. You're fine. And walks away. But she sees the car and notices that her mom's stuff, that her mom isn't on a mission. She isn't on this trip, as Montrose says. So she knows that something's up there. But, during this time, we see one of the Topsy girls sees her again and she's off running again. I will say the little girl Topsy storyline didn't work for me, and we'll talk about it at the end. But a lot of that stuff, to me, some of the visuals were cool and all that, but I wish they would have handled that a lot different, because it just kind of it was very jarring whenever those moments happen. But as we move forward, we see Tick and Montrose having a conversation, guys, and Tick asks him, did you cheat on Mama? And he tells him, no, I only did that when she died. But I'm still thinking about Dora, man. I don't think Dora's dead, man. We haven't seen a body. We don't know how she died. So, but either way, Montrose tells him about, this pastor that he knew at the age of 8, how he saw the pastor hooking up with another guy. It was a rumor for a little bit, but then they came up and snatched him out of that church and, put him in an asylum, as Montrose says. And at that point when Montrose saw that, that's why he has this cover up. That's why he has his life, because he doesn't, as he says in this moment, he doesn't want to end up like that pastor in an asylum. So he explains his love for his mama Dora and how their relationship kind of worked. We still don't know if they had sex and had Atticus or Uncle George. We still don't know all that. That's another secret that I'm waiting to find out. And it's funny because Montrose and Tick have a scene later on when he says, are there other secrets you haven't told me? And it's like, yeah, I'm not your dad. But as we kind of see within the scene, we understand this relationship that Montrose and Tick's mom Dora had. And Tick tells Montrose that Letitia's pregnant and that she didn't tell him, but the way that he found out, ladies and gentlemen, is due to last week's time travel, multiverse travels, where he went into the future. He found that book that we talked about, and that wasn't the Uncle George, that wasn't George Freeman that we know. That was his son from the future that wrote this book that we'll talk about here in a bit, but very interesting stuff, no less. What else did he find in the future? He tells us what he saw, but we'll talk about it a little bit later. So we see this really interesting scene between Letitia and Christina in the church, where we see Letitia's praying about the protection of Tick, praying for the family of Emmett Till, and then we see Christina walks in. This meeting was set up yet again by one of our favorite characters. Letitia set this meeting up, and we have this moment where Christina approaches her and they talk about, she didn't think that Letitia was a woman of faith. And Letitia replies, well, I wasn't until I died and came back alive, which I love that they bring that back, because I'm always still wondering, how is she affected by being dead and coming back to life? But, that was all the way since episode 2. But they talk about this conversation about what's the difference between magic and religion. And Christina tells her about the people, heaven and hell, and it's one of the same. Just a lot of interesting dialogue in this scene here for me. I really love the back and forth. We learn that Letitia actually called her there, which I mentioned there, and then she gives her the negatives from Titus's pages, and she wants Tick to be protected, wants him to be invulnerable, as she puts it. As we see Christina cast the scalar protection on Letitia. She gives her the mark of Cain, which was very pivotal to a scene later on in this episode. But that cane mark looks very similar to the mark that William had on his chest, but we know that William died. Or did he? I think he's dead because we saw him in the basement, but that was the same mark, man. Why did he die if he had that mark of protection, which Christina has on her, which we'll talk about later? But very interesting moment to say the least. We go back to Dee as she's again running from these Topsy characters. We see that she's spying on Lancaster, and we notice that these Topsy girls are getting closer to Dee. So as we go back to Montrose and Tick, we see Tick tells Montrose that the key doesn't work that he gave Christina, and he asks if Hippolyta is stuck in the future, which again, we don't know if she's coming back. Again, the writers of the show said that she's gone, but we don't know for how long. He talks about how when he went into the portal, he saw his son and got the book, but then this robot arm pushed him out of the portal. I'm assuming this is the aliens that Hippolyta interacted with last week, or was that Hippolyta with the robot arm? Maybe she's becoming these celestial beings that we know from last week's portal. So, this is a really interesting scene here. We see Tick talks about the book that his son wrote. It's about the family history, right? As he describes the story, he talks about the differences in the book. And let me know if you guys can tell the difference. He says that Christina's a man. Uncle George survives. Dee is a boy. Does it sound familiar? Well, that's because that is the storyline from the actual 2016 Lovecraft Country book by Mark Ruff. So I love how the show, that very meta moment, to say the least, of describing the book that is based on the book that's based on this show. It's just very meta, right? But he says that Christina sacrifices, in the book, he sacrifices Tick to become immortal, which might explain that flashback that we got in episode 6 with Gia. So all this is going to happen within 5 days, guys, which probably leads up to the finale. They're casting a spell, can kill Tick, and he says that. And in a very nice moment here, he asks for some fatherly advice. First time we've seen this all season, right? And Montrose says, well, I'm going to do whatever it takes to protect my son and my grandson. Very, very nice moment. Montrose is still some questionable things about him, but that was a really nice moment. So for the first time ever, we spend a little bit than just 2 seconds with Captain Lancaster. So we see him reading about the paper about Letitia and her boarding house that we saw was written on her from episode 3. And this is probably my favorite moment, even though I love the moment with Christina and Ruby and the transformation, the conversations they have, and a lot of other moments, especially at the end. But this moment here was a very crowd-pleasing moment for me personally. We see Letitia just walk into the office, or it's not Letitia, but Diana, as Wonder Woman herself, walks into the room like a straight-up boss and says, asks if my mother is dead. He says, well, probably, and he explains the spit spell that he put on her, and that in exchange, from earlier, she corrects the officer about what her mother's name really means, but in this scene, we see Lancaster agrees to lift this spell from her by giving her the Ori. And man, I was kind of confused. I'm like, why don't you just do it yourself? Which he ended up doing in this episode. But nonetheless, I love this moment, guys. One of my favorite moments of the episode, maybe one of my favorite moments of the season. Dee says, forget you, in a more vulgar way of saying that, using the F-bomb there, forget you, spits on him to get him back for spitting on her earlier, and calls him a pig, and walks out of the room and says, oh, by the way, it fucking stinks in here. I love that moment, man. That was like my favorite moment of the whole episode. The cop gets up to chase after her, and Lancaster says, we don't need her. She's dead anyway, and I'm going to get what I deserve, as we know that what he does at the end of this episode. But we see Dee get us on her bike, and she doesn't seem scary anymore. She just runs right past these things on her bicycle. I was hoping that she kind of fought them, which she does at the end, but nonetheless, she is now, reclaiming her name, right, which is Diana, the Prince of the Amazonians, right, as Wonder Woman. I love that Greek mythology there. But as we kind of move forward, we see Montrose with Tick, another father and son moment as they're working together for the first time. So we see Tick, or Montrose, reads the spell, messes it up. He talks about being dyslexic, and Tick makes a joke about, like, what else have you been hiding from me? Which, again, in that moment, he wanted to tell Tick something else, which I think is he's not his father. Hopefully we get that reveal sooner rather than later. But as we kind of move forward, Montrose seems, or we see, Montrose recites the spell, and nothing appears to happen. Or did it? Now, this scene here, help me out with this scene, guys. This was very confusing. Christina and these men are on this this lake area. There's something to exchange about money, and then we see, I'm thinking that this is very similar to the episode that we got in episode 2 when she was giving birth to those creatures, but nonetheless, like I said, I was very confused because, we see them beating her up. She kind of fights back. They shoot her in the stomach. They wrap her neck around with barbed wire. They push her in the lake. And I couldn't hear what the guy said because I don't have subtitles on my early screener, so I don't know. He said something about that's a bad way to die or something. But no less, we see that within seconds she pops out of the lake and she's alive and she has the mark of Cain on her stomach. So was it a setup? Was that Lancaster? Who are those guys? Have we met them before? What was that scene? Help me out in that scene, guys. Let me know in the comments what you guys thought about that. So back. Hey, what's going on, everybody? Elliot here from Movie Files. Hope you're enjoying the review. So as I'm putting this together, as I'm editing this video, and I'm rewatching that scene, guys, with Christina that I was very confused about. And after talking to my buddy Griffin at Film Speak, I think it's safe to say that Christina was trying to recreate what happened to Emmett Till. In some weird way, she's trying to feel what Ruby felt and having that trauma and having that grieving process by having these guys beat her up, brutally beat her up, wrapping barbed wire around her neck and throwing her into that lake. So let me know in the comments, is that something that you guys felt was going on here or something else entirely? Again, hope you're enjoying this review. Let's continue the conversation in the comments below. Back to Letitia. Well, she sees in a dark room. Ruby appears. They have a really good conversation. Letitia tells her about being pregnant, and then Ruby tells her in exchange for that note, she tells her about everything that's going on with Christina, about the spells, why she wanted to be a white woman, that she's now claiming herself to be back to who she wants to be, and she wants to have these powers of magic. She doesn't want to be white anymore, and she wants to create her own space, and that Christina will help her teach her. So as everyone, and within this scene, we see someone screams at Leti that come upstairs. But let's go back to that scene. So really within this scene, guys, we're really seeing Ruby kind of confront the situation with Christina. Again, I asked it earlier, is it Christina taking advantage of Ruby or is it Ruby taking advantage of Christina? I think there's a mixture of A and B. I think Christina, Ruby sees it as an opportunity to learn magic, but in exchange for that, we see that Ruby needs help from Christina. So there's a little bit of both going on in that scene, but I really love that she tells her the truth. One, about everything with Christina, about the spells, but also Letitia telling her that she's pregnant. So I really appreciated that moment. But like I said, someone's calling for Letitia upstairs because as we know what happens later, the cops are there. So like I said, I don't know why Lancaster hasn't done this since the very beginning, but he tries to attempt to go into the house. He can't go into the house because of the spell from episode 3, keeping all the bad spirits out of the house, to say the least. So we think that they're gone, but they're not. They start shooting up the place. We see, which is this really cool scene. Letitia remembers that she has that cane mark and the bullets just flying past her, bouncing off her. I love that moment. It's really cool visual there. And Letitia just a boss. Those bullets are bouncing off of her. So as we kind of wrap up the episode, back to Dee, we see she's preparing for this fight. We see these creatures are coming into Uncle George's place and their mom's place, their business. And I'm not going to lie, like I said, all the D and the Topsy girl stuff, a lot of that stuff didn't work for me. And in this moment in particular, when we see the girl look at the camera with her tongue out and close the door, I literally hated that moment. I'm not gonna lie, it took me out of the scene. So we see Montrose trying to save her. He breaks into the door, but we see, I don't know if this is alluding to her dying, but we see that the monsters get into her arm and split her arm open. So we'll see what happens with D. But as we wrap up the episode, this was such a fantastic moment. Tig comes to the house. We see that he sees them shooting at the house. The cop sees him. Letitia sees that the cop sees him. She runs outside. One of the cops shoots the gun, and I'm thinking okay, G is gonna pop up, but no. And if she was gonna pop up, obviously she's gonna be the Kimimaro, the fox monster. But we see the monsters from episode 1 pop out of the ground from Artem, and they just go ham. They are killing these cops left and right, putting their tail through their faces. We're seeing cars flying all over the place. This moment reminded me so much of episode 1. I was cheering. I was so in love with this scene because it reminded me so much of the last 10 minutes of that first episode, guys. I love this moment, to say the least. But as we see the monster tears Lancaster apart now, it's really interesting because in that scene he tears his arm off, and I'm thinking to myself, Is that explain why Captain Lancaster had that black torso back in episode 5? But the timelines don't match up when we saw that scene and when we see him getting torn apart and him having these new body parts. So is there some time going on, some time travel, time altering situations? But again, or maybe this is Lancaster, he's dead. I don't know if we're going to ever explain the black torso or if that was why he had a black torso and we're going back in time or fast forward in time. I do not know. One of the episodes that are coming up, I think next week, is called Rewind 1921, which would allude to the Tulsa writings, but also can allude to other things being affected by time. So nonetheless, I hope Lancaster's dead, but I want them to explain who that guy was in the closet, why he had the black torso, but we'll see what comes of it. As the monster takes out all the cops, runs up to Letitia and Tick. We think the monster has something maybe he wants to do to them, but nope. Tick puts his hand on the monster, and Letitia says the spell works, fade to black. So the biggest thing, like I said, my criticism with this episode was as we focus, each week we focus on one character. I liked the D moment when she's in the office, but I didn't like the D stuff with the Topsy girl characters following her around. I found that stuff to be very, very jarring, especially when the creature looks at the camera and smiles. I hated that moment, and I just found like all those moments that we saw D being followed by these creatures, there's probably a super in-depth reason why they chose those creatures and what that means, but to me it didn't really work on a lot of levels. But I love D in that moment in the office, so that was like my biggest criticism with this episode. And also, this isn't really a criticism, but it was a lot to unpack in this episode. Stuff with Christina, stuff with the Emmett Till stuff that I thought the show did a pretty good job of handling. But let me know how you guys feel about that. I love the stuff that we got with Tick and Montrose finally becoming father and son. We'll see what comes of that. Tick finding out about his son writing the book, and I love that meta moment of the book being talked about in this show. So all that stuff, and then of course the last 10 minutes was just phenomenal to me. So like I said, I'm borderline thinking this is my favorite episode, but literally that D and that Topsy girl stuff really kind of brings it down just a little bit. But again, if you guys talk about it in the comments, say, hey, this is how I interpret those scenes, this is why these scenes are great with the Topsy stuff. But it's there because, again, there's so much to love about this episode, from the in-depth conversations about grieving, especially when there's injustices involved. I love the stuff, again, with Montrose and Tick, with Christina just being great in this episode and manipulating everyone and having some great conversations with Letitia and Ruby kind of reclaiming herself as a black woman, Letitia having the cane spell. So there's a lot to love with this episode, guys. So, man, go ahead. Comment. This is a long video. This is my longest review yet, 40 plus minutes, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know your pros, your cons, of course, your theories about next week. I believe next week is, if I'm not mistaken, I think it is 1921, Rewind 1921, as I pull it up on my phone here. I believe that is the title, ladies and gentlemen, and I am correct. So next week's episode is titled Rewind 1921. It is very interesting if this is true. Jig-a-Bobo was directed by Misha Green, so this is the first time she's directed an episode. So very interesting to see what comes next week in Rewind 1921. Is Hippolyta still out there? Is she going to come back? Will we understand what happened with the baby, of the birth of the creature? Who were those guys that killed Christina or thought they killed Christina? Who put those guys to do that? We only got 2 episodes left to figure out these answers, guys. So let me know what you guys are thinking. Again, make sure to like, share, comment, subscribe. Again, I know this is a long video. For those that are still sticking around 40 plus minutes later, thank you so much for watching this review. Let me know your thoughts. Hope you guys have a great week. Appreciate you watching this video once again, and we'll see you on the next video.